And then they revealed that solids were not solid, that a wall was not solid, that it consisted of molecules fixed and vibrating some distance apart, as did the flesh. That solidity was really the likelihood of stuff not falling between two chairs, down the gaps, and that walking through the wall was not impossible, that it could be like slipping between pine trunks into a forest, which had looked from the road impermeable, but was where something lived, and that one could peer back from the gloom towards the light, a different creature, with tender eyes, with an ear for water. So that's a poem from Public Dream, which was my first book, came out in 2007. I'm going to just read a couple more from that, and then I'll move on to the newer work. But I do think there's quite a lot of, perhaps not stylistic continuity, or even thematic continuity exactly, but a continuity of sensibility perhaps between the two books that might be interesting to talk about with Lavinia later on, or with you if you're interested in that. I'm going to read a poem now called Incubus. I'm interested, I find myself repeatedly drawn to ideas to do with power and powerlessness. And this particular poem is written in the voice of a woman who is trying to describe and understand some kind of assault that she feels has happened to her. And her inability to pin this down to a particular crime or a particular perpetrator seemed to me emblematic of the ways in which women have to deal with covert and institutional types of discrimination every day, really. So it's something that's in the water and you get used to. And the image at the centre of this is of the incubus, which is a medieval demon thought to visit women at night and have their way with them while the women were asleep. So Merlin, for example, in the Arthurian legends, is supposed to be the offspring of a human woman and an incubus. Incubus. I've heard of it happening to other women, and other women say they've heard it happens, but thought it could not happen to them, or that if it did, they would fight for justice, whatever it took. And I've heard of it taking several years to come to nothing, several years along with the rest. Since it happened to me, I've heard me saying I'd heard this sort of thing could happen to thousands of women, but I never thought it could happen to somebody such as myself. And then I heard me demanding justice, whatever it took. Now it is taking the rest of my life to come to nothing, the rest of my life along with the rest. What seems to be the problem is this, that I was completely alone when it happened. I don't mean alone in the room with him, alone with him. I mean really alone, alone with nothing. There was no witness. I am a victim and cannot be witness. One must play one role or the other. If I bore witness, I'd not be a victim. He would be victim if he had been there. And if he'd been there, then he would be witness against himself. But I was alone, alone with nothing. The window was open. The wind and the rain were driving in, the facts of life lifting the curtains. And I was asleep. I don't know when. What happens now is I make a confession. Confess, though I am the victim here, to having the most incredible dreams I believed were real as long as they lasted. To having had dreams I believed were ended, when the end was only a part of the dream, the part where you wake in your own bedroom, glad to be woken, till the door creaks, and whatever it was you were running from walks right in. I confess to recurring dreams in which my room is haunted, that seem more real than my waking life, to a ghost who comes in the form of a pressure imprisoning me by sternum and shoulders and thighs as if I were caught under glass. Here you will ask if I ever protested, pushed him away or cried for help, if I fought my end, if I offered resistance and made him aware of my lack of desire with words he could readily comprehend, in the face of his power, tearing my slip aside without touching, without coming near, if I spoke though I was unable to speak, or moved though I was unable to move, unable even to turn my head in darkness whether I happened to see a distinguishing feature or felt like revealing if he was a stranger or someone I know. And I'll tell you again that I witnessed nothing more than I've mentioned, and nothing less. I know what you're thinking. This isn't a crime. A crime requires a perpetrator to put in the dock, to accuse or defend, to finish the plot. But there's nobody here. Years ago, there would have been bodies, physical bodies at which I could point and call them up to account for their cells under my nails, their spit on my neck. But now they've learnt to walk through walls. If I could give you a face or a name, we'd have a dynamic. And yet, if I did, this still would not be considered a crime of a certain order, but something less, something one should take on the chin, something that could have been worse. Now, am I sleeping, or am I awake? This court seems more like the court of a dream I visit each night, improperly dressed, in which I am doomed to repeat myself, and in the repeating I doom myself before these 100 unfriendly faces, to find no relief in the drop of the gavel which never arrives. A dream, all right, a dream of running. The limbs refuse, the air resists with the slowness of water. The mind outpaces the body and sees a child falling, but fails to react, as I saw what was coming, but failed to react, locked inside my sleeping body. I'll never release myself from that. In fact, I'll go, yes. Okay, power. So my second book is called Disinformation, and I'll read you the title poem from that. I was interested in putting the book together in ways that didn't really become evident to me until quite late in the process, that a lot of the poems were to do with the relationship between power and knowledge, and the ways in which knowledge is manipulated by those who are in a position to do so in order to extract or induce certain feelings and responses from others who are dependent on them. So this happens at the level of sort of an institutional level, obviously, government, media, employers, and so on, but also on a personal level, I think, in interpersonal relationships in the family as well. So hopefully the book explores a few different levels at which that type of thing occurs. But I'm particularly interested in the way that poetry occupies quite a complicated relationship with truth and with the idea of disinformation. And one of the things I wanted to indicate in calling the book that was not just our negative associations with disinformation, but also the ways in which poetry might be seen as something that exists in opposition to information in the information age, as it were, that there are things that poetry does and allows that information can't touch. Disinformation. I am making jelly for my nephew's 4th birthday party. Any flavour as long as it's red. Bouncy cubes snipped and stirred into hot water in a cloudy Pyrex dish. Rediscovering the secret of isinglass, or is it horse gelatin? While a radio announcer intimates that certain unpopular facts about the operations hitherto repressed, like signs removed from crossroads and bridges in occupied lands, can now be revealed if we just stay tuned. Party bags designed to please infants pile on the counter, 2 bright colours, badly made. Blue napkins, party poppers. My red hands put cylinders of sausage on cocktail sticks. These pass for traditions. And all the time I listen to them talk fluently about foreknowledge, proactivity, stations. It is winter, treacherous to walk. The children are on their way by now, adults too, bundled against the promise of snow. And the entertainer, with tricks and jokes hidden under a blanket in the boot of his Volvo, limp balloons into which he will blow his lungs full of ideal animals, practices misdirection. I chop yellow cheese. Out the kitchen window, the whirligig turns. Metal spokes, merciless as diagrams, cutting the air, no clothing softens. Tiny gems, icing the nodes where their lines intersect. Every extant leaf is fixed with glitter, where the glue's dried clear. The next poem is called Pyramid, and it's, I suppose it's my credit crunch poem, as it were. I was working in a school, so this was about 2010, and I had a quiet hour to myself in the classroom. This was a school in London. And that was really, 2010 in the UK was really, I suppose, the point at which you began to see very physical manifestations around you of the recession. You began to see the way that it was actually changing the landscape of the country. And one of the ways in which it did that was by stopping building projects. So I was living in Sheffield at the time. Obviously I was at the school in London, but I was living in Sheffield at the time, and there was this huge project that the city was very proud of to erect a new hotel right in the town centre. And it was supposed to have this fantastic penthouse on top, but it never got the penthouse. It just kind of stopped at the top, and there was this bits of scaffolding and sort of tarpaulins at the top. For years it was like that. And I looked out of this classroom in London, and I saw loads of cranes that were not moving. And you know, it was the middle of the day, it was the working day in the week, and it just set something off. So that's really where this poem came from. And the image of the pyramid, I was thinking also about pyramid schemes, and the way the person at the top collects all of the money and everybody else is kind of scraping along underneath them. And where that comes from, really, the Egyptian, the architectural structure of the pyramid and what that emblematized about the social structure at the time. You know, your pharaoh at the top and all your minions down below doing the hard work. Pyramid. All along the skyline, cranes quiet above rooftops, conspicuous as knives dropped vertically into carpet, folded ironing board upright or set at right angles, corner brackets bolting the sky to the ground. They dangle claws on chains, unbaited hooks balanced by elevated breeze blocks into the unfinished town, fishing a pond that hasn't been stocked. Their paintworks bright as Max in rain, or the mops and pans a woman once persuaded me to sell door to door, describing in the air of her living room a pyramid, most mysterious of all mysterious ecstasies, her red nail climbing floors to the vertex where it stood or floated, as she effortlessly said, "In no time at all, you'll have a lifestyle just like mine." Through the cranes' necks, the cloudburst rings. Across the clad stone hotel, still missing its penthouse, its punchline, bucketing down like the old cartoon where a skeleton drinks champagne. This is another topical poem. I had a good year for writing poems, 2010. This one was, I find poems often come from a collision of at least two things that ordinarily would have very little to do with one another. And the sparks and the tension that is generated by that combining and that trying to wrestle different concerns into a single formal space is part of where the energy of the writing comes from. In this case, I was reading an awful lot of Elizabeth Bishop and writing about her. So that was sort of one half of the portrait. And the other half was all the imagery I was seeing from the Deepwater Horizon spill off the coast of Louisiana and the effect that was having on the landscape and the oceanscape, as it were, at the time. So I find myself writing this quite strange poem in which I imagined that Elizabeth Bishop was alive and well and working as some kind of PR representative for BP, and found herself in Louisiana trying to sort of deal with some of the PR fallout from these events. Bishop in Louisiana. 12 days since I took up my post in this village. a handful of clapboard houses crowded round the harbour, and the concrete yards glittering with scales, where church groups serve up grits and tamales from long trestle tables and the interiors of white vans. I myself eat at the hotel, beef, pasta, anything but fish, watching the Black Sea break foamlessly against the chemical barricade. On its surface, orange curds ride like surfboards or children's life preservers. After dinner, I take my coffee in the privacy of my suite. There is little to accomplish here. I walk on the beach, where the nests of common terns driven upwind to breed are marked with red flags mounted on popsicle sticks. Hundreds of them, bunting in the wind. Each nest is no more than a dint in the sand, easily made with a fist. Yesterday I saw a dead sea turtle turning to soup inside its own shell. I am not immune to the irony of this. I write checks for the fishermen fitting their boats with booms to skim the water, and speak to sad newscasters under a fly-past of helicopters and a crop duster salute. Try to imagine what 100 million litres means. You can't. At night, before bed, in the surprisingly deep bath, I push my big toe into the streaming faucet and feel its pressure turn to a hot, relentless gush, nightmarishly pleasurable, like pissing myself in my sleep. So that's I guess another angle on disinformation would be the sort of the idea of cleaning up the oil spill of bad PR at the same time as you're cleaning up the oil spill of everything else. I'm going to read another poem now that touches a little bit on that. This came from a very different place. This was a commission I was given by the National Gallery to write a poem in response to an exhibition of Titian's paintings. And it was the first time in, I think, over 200 years that his three paintings on the Actaeon and Diana myth were collected together in the same place. And I found myself sitting for a very long time in front of the latest of those paintings, The Death of Actaeon, which is a beautifully anachronistically impressionistic-looking piece of work. It's full of movement. It's an incredibly dynamic painting. And it shows Actaeon half transformed into the stag against this woodland backdrop, and Diana in the lower left side of the painting, aiming her bow at him, and there's a sense that she is physically there overseeing this transformation. I wanted to try and write about it in a way that didn't use the deer and the hounds motif, because that felt to me that just one of the most obvious and immediate and striking things about the Actaeon story, and it has been explored in so many different ways. But it really connected with some of the other ideas I was working with at the time about how we deal with information and how we might control or manipulate information. And it felt to me that Diana was controlling this situation by refusing to see Actaeon as distinct from the woodland backdrop anymore. The kind of the deer that he is turning into is very autumnal in colour and really fitted in very beautifully with the trees that are painted behind him. So the poem became a way of exploring, I guess, issues of denial and silence in the construction of narratives. Woodland burial. Thrown water touched him, and where it touched, it said his body was the same brownness leaves turn when autumn is upon us, a swept-up heap, trembling where it stood. That when the huntress concentrated, trees, tree shadows, underbrush and bushes made a wood. And it was ever thus, that nothing can be other than as known by a god, no truth a lie, no death long sleep. Poised with springy longbow drawn and back to the sun, the one who had revealed her form from landscape or eyes, independent as a streak of white paint on a mirror, held him on her gaze, and held the torn canopy of clouds on the water, as she might have kept a spoonful of honey in the warm fold of her tongue before it dissipated. not the greatest possible harm, which needs to be known and named as such to achieve its end, not what he fled, but the unofficial crime. The moment she let her attention crop those deep, recursive avenues of beach to a backdrop he broke against, confused. So nothing in the landscape escaped his touch, and nothing left of him was in the picture she composed. This is all quite heavy, isn't it? I think I'm going to read something a bit more fun. Excuse me. This is poems come from all kinds of places. One of the other places I find that they come from is just interesting words that I find that I haven't come across before. Collecting vocabulary is something that poets like to do. Well, all writers like to do, but poets pride themselves on doing that. So this poem is called Trimmings, and it was a sort of experiment in constructing a poem from frivolous things, superfluous bits of vocabulary that are really, in some ways, ornamental and sparkly and attention-grabbing, to me at least. It's in 3 sections, and each one is called after a word that I found particularly generative in some way. So the first section is called Frangelico, which is a type of hazelnut liqueur, as I'm sure you all know. There's a little bit of Francis Frangelico punning going on in there somewhere. The second one is called Lametta, which is if you take all the sparkly bits off the string of tinsel and just throw them on the tree. That's Lametta, you get these bags of it. And Periptero is the Greek word for those little kiosks that sell everything you could possibly want except the thing you're actually looking for next to the beach. And they just sort of appear everywhere. They're amazing little things. So this is Trimmings. Frangelico. It slops from coppery glass Dominican cassocks, thicker than water, thinned syrup crackling and smoking over ice, pale as hearts of hazelnuts half caramelized, or relics lit in cabinets. Angelic alcoholic for kids, all quickening sweetness without the burnt palate. It's praline, guilt, milk chocolate. Don't knock it. Also, don't drink a lot of it. Handy mnemonic for nuts and Alps, the Piedmont and Languedoc. Our father, fluent Occitan, orthodox Baroque brass fixtures, all the schmaltzy terror of Christmas. Bright liqueur, maple sap, throat's lacquer, misnomer, namesake. Couldn't quench a thirst, of course, but gives occasion for it. Lametta. Fuck me, I love that stuff. Tinsel stripped like a tarragon stalk of its million radial tines, nervy with static in shredded cascades, angle confounding and biddable as a fistful of grasshoppers. It implicates itself perpetually in socks, hell-bent as Japanese knotweed on travel, and infiltrates the kitchenette, which seems, beside its disco stooks, too much of a muchness, too matter-of-fact. Could we dress all utilities in spangles of Lametta, revel in the vulgar Italian TV, indestructible attention splatter, the cat-bewitching twitch and dangle, the dross? Would things be worse or better? And Periptero. Apparently peripatetic, it pops up wherever I go, glistening on my shoulder, gold epaulette, albatross, piñata stuffed with bubblegum, filter tips, lottery tickets, mute cascades of laminated sleeves, difficult to care about, much harder to reject. Less explicably, there are sewing patterns, puzzle books, and tiny plastic helicopters bearing stigmata from the moulds where they were cast. The proprietor slams the shutters up and locks himself inside like a djinn in a lamp, a night-busy, helping hand kobold in a kitchen, utterly invested in the enterprise, inseparable from it. What is the epicenter everyone reports, but the staple through the nipple of a centerfold? Okay. One thing I've been experimenting with recently is some amount of translation, a small amount of translation. There is one translation in this book, and I might read in a minute a couple of others I've been working on. I'm not a natural translator, I'm not a linguist, but I do find something, have managed to get to the point where I find something incredibly exciting about occupying somebody else's forms and trying to make a home for myself within them, and trying to do that with a certain amount of elasticity and collaboration, as it were. Certainly not a faithful translator as such. So this, I'm going to read for you now, is a version of an Anglo-Saxon poem called The Ruin. So this is from the 10th century Exeter book, the book in which we also have Beowulf. Nobody knows who wrote it. It's one of those anonymous Anglo-Saxon poems. And what it describes is a series of Roman ruins. It's a Dark Age poet looking at a series of Roman ruins and imagining what the Roman city must have been like when it was in its heyday. And so it's an expression of sort of awe and respect for the architectural knowledge of the Romans in that period, at a point when that knowledge and that building understanding had been lost. So I called it Reconstruction, and I have taken a few liberties, but hopefully something of his wonder and excitement is in there somewhere. The future creates these fabulous blueprints. From cities it pulls to the ground. What seems the work of giants lies diminished. Domes cave, towers like telescopes collapse upon themselves. The icy gate, like a berg, breaks up, and hoarfrost serves as poor man's grout. All promises of sanctuary disband into dust as the centuries pass. The earth's fist closes on the architects, cold and catacombed, while 100 generations live above their heads. Here, for example, here stood a wall, bearded with lichen and swabbed with blood, not swayed by storms or the rise and fall of kingdom after kingdom. Tall or deep, it tumbled at last. Only thrown stones remain, moulded by the wind, going on milling against themselves down in the grass. Where once the light of knowledge lay across these fiddly crafts, mud crusts offer up proof of a mind that swiftly wove its ringed design, and that someone sharp bound the wall braces together with wire. Think how intricate the city must have been. Archipelagos of bathing pools, bristling gables, the bored glint of swords on patrol, and open casks at every corner, round which camaraderie spiraled like confetti orbiting a plug hole, until the future finished all that. Bodies piled 3 men deep for miles, a city of bones it must have been. And what disease bred in that grand decomposition claimed the remaining artisans? Time turned their temples into desecrated tombs. The whole endeavour came undone. Idols of clay and the talented hands that shaped them lay in bare, scratched graves. Fences flattened. This red, curved ceremonial roof drops its tiles from the ceiling vault. Civilization falls to the floor in dribbling heaps like everything else. Here, where many a man of the past, blazing with wine, blinding in the spoils of war, bounced his gaze from treasure to treasure, gold to silver, coins to trinkets, rings to cups, pinballing angles round the faceted rock of the mirrored enclosure's endless reign. Here, where stone buildings stood, flowing water threw out heat in massive clouds, and the mortar circled the known world within its embrace, where the baths lay, hot as hearts that prize their own convenience. I've embarked upon a new and sort of slightly terrifying translation project. I'm doing a version of George Sepharis's great Greek modernist poem, Mythostorma, which is just a beautiful, beautiful piece of work about failed journeys and lost origins and how to live in a culture that had such a golden age, particularly in the 20th century, the early 20th century, amidst all of that disarray and upheaval. And it's a sort of a mythic adventure, the poem, and very beautiful. So I've been trying to engage with that in some ways, and I thought I would just briefly read a couple of the sections from that for you. Section 2 and section 5. Another cave, another well. Once upon a time, you could make your friends happy, the friends you still had, by winching up keepsakes and models from its depths. Now the ropes have frayed and fallen. Only the grooves they rubbed in passing remind us of what we knew. Fingertips touching the well's lip, as the poet said, feel the cool sensation of stone before the body spoils it by infusing false warmth. The cave bets its soul and loses. The moment's glass is filled with a dry silence. And this one is called Argonauts. Some of them in the sections have subtitles. This is Argonauts after Jason's companions on the journey to find the Golden Fleece, and later sort of heroic figures in the Trojan War. They are to be able to claim an Argonaut somewhere in your family history was a kind of great prize. We never knew them, but we nursed deep down some hope that we met them once. Maybe, in passing, oblivious kids that we were. Perhaps we saw them a couple of times in the streets before they dragged those bags of coal, those bundles of wheat to their ships, our friends, and sailed beyond the sea forever. Now dawn finds us beside our tired lamps. By their light we labour to draw 12 rugged ships, the mermaids they encountered, a blaring conch. We go down to the river at dusk because it demonstrates the path to the sea. Nights we spend in cellars that reek of tar. Our friends whom we never saw have left us, thinking that perhaps we only met them when our dreams drew us close to the breathing waves. We look for them because we are looking beyond the statues for a different life. I think probably I'll make this the last one. This poem is called A Shrunken Head, and I don't know if any of you have ever been to the Pitt Rivers Museum in Oxford. They have 9 or 10 shrunken human heads there that were brought over at the very end of the 19th century, early 20th century from Ecuador, Peru, that kind of region. And there's so many debates around the possession of human remains by Western museums, particularly over the last 30 years, and lots of artefacts have been repatriated. But the heads haven't, partly because nobody's asked for them back, partly because the museum wouldn't actually know who to give them to either, because the tribal system and dividing lines and territorial lines have been redrawn so much over the last 100 years that it would be difficult to locate ancestors, descendants as it were, to give them back to. So for the moment they remain where they are. I was really just fascinated by them as objects, and they are one of the things in the museum that people are magnetically drawn to. I was interested to read about the way that they were created. I don't just mean the physical process of the kind of the stripping of the skin from the skull and the boiling and the stitching and all this kind of stuff, but also the reasons behind it. So you would imagine that it was an act of vengeance to kind of desecrate the body after the warrior who was defeated had died. But actually it was a sort of act of reconciliation. The idea was that the soul of the fallen warrior would be inducted into the tribe of the warrior who had killed him. And that was a sort of a ritualistic aspect of the head shrinking. and the warrior would then keep the heads that he had won with him as a sort of little tribe of his own, part of his own kinship bonds. So it was a formation of a kinship bond, actually, that was behind that. And I began to wonder whether, if this head did still have some kind of putative consciousness, if it might have begun to feel that it was part of the tribe of the museum, having spent so long there since it was brought over. So those were some of the ideas behind the poem. The poem is spoken in the voice of the head, which is, I hope, a knowingly inappropriate thing to do. And in the poem, the head is being sent home, but it doesn't want to go. A shrunken head. In the cargo hold, cruising at 30,000 feet above blue islands, galactically cold, I float between Oxford and the site where I was found, then traded on. I cannot see for bubble wrap. At this stage in my repatriation, I belong to no one, a blip, a birdie ounce in the undercarriage. Only the curator knows I've gone and who is left. She redesigns the tour. Lizard bones replace me. Indigenous crafts distract with dyed feathers from an absence. So, in me, no memory withstood the leather-thonged, moth-kissed costume of an Eskimo, its upright hood ringed with reindeer fur like frost, regarding me for years without a face across the Victorian cabinets. Or a cruel long spear, frozen in space, dressed like a wrist with jade and jet. Or Bobo, as I named him, his heavy puss pursed like a clown's, like a freshly sprung mushroom, observing silence. I miss being part of the known quantifiable index, the massive mouths of children smearing the glass case, sometimes shocked and crying, more often delighted to learn of my fate, sneaking pictures for school reports. Their flashes filled me up with light, like water would a calabash, or cauterizing beams from night security did the displays. For hours after, I'd see patterns that couldn't be real, shadow plays, huge birds fighting each other up the loaded walls. I'd imagine hands to rub my eyelids with, lift them and feel the cross stitches holding me in, my vengeful breath trapped beneath their seals, wanting for the first time in lifetimes to exhale, to spit red berries or the prattle of a curse. Then that would fail in the force of my several injuries, and I'd seem to drop towards a far ocean, armless, footless, a seed head blown without will or hope or wishing upon through the middle of a crown to land on my shelf, under rows of wooden masks and blown birds' eggs, smelling the open jar of myself, salt sweet as tamarisk, mild as figs. Thank you very much for listening. Thank you.